final segment on the Irish Red that I started last time. There'll be more segments, but this is going to be the bottling. So we've gone through all of the brewing. All I've done is I've let it sit in the carboy for 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, you should be ready to bottle. With this recipe at least. There are some that have to take longer, but 2 weeks is a good average. Alright, the first part's a little bit tricky. You can buy all of this at your brew store. This is just a siphon. You'll buy it, it's one piece. You notice that little black thing on the end? That guards yeast from getting into it, or that's the idea. What I'm trying to do is get all of the beer out with as little of the yeast or sediment, as it's called, out. So I want to leave the sediment in and get the beer out. So obviously I can't pour it over or it's just going to go all over the place. I mean the yeast will go in there anyway. Okay, so here's my bucket. Remember that oops, there's still water in it. Remember that I used this for one of the processes in my first brewings. So I'm just going to put this beer into here, make sure it's a bucket with a spout, and I'll show you why in just a minute. I'm going to do a quick rinse out because I always like to rinse things multiple times. And another note, I've got some bottles here, I've got this bucket, I've got this siphon. Everything was sanitized before I started. That took actually a pretty long while. Probably longer than this segment's going to take. The idea of a siphon is pretty easy. You just get gravity to work for you. You have to get the beer over this high point, and then when you do, gravity is going to naturally pull it down and into your bucket. So you just suck on one end until you get to about here or so, and then you let it go, and it's supposed to have gravity do the rest of the work for you. They are a little tricky, so let me see if I can get it. See, you have that happen a lot. I'm not sure why, and the siphon isn't the best. It needs modified a bit. Maybe. Here's one trick that I've learned, and I think because my siphon, I think my hose should be a little smaller than my siphon. But this, I don't know, I think this siphon is 3/8 of an inch, and this hose is just a standard size. But notice you've got a big air bubble here, and then it's going really good under that. If you pinch right above the air bubble, make another air bubble and let go, sometimes that will work that air bubble out. Now I could let it go like this for the entire time, and there's really nothing wrong with that, but it will go slower. And I want to siphon this as fast as I can, so I'm going to work all the air bubbles I can. Notice I'm just getting closer and closer to the top. You have to do a little air bubble at a time. Don't try to do it all at once. That seems to be working pretty well this time. Okay, so now the whole hose is solid color. That means you're going as fast as you can. So, I just have to wait. Notice again, I think I mentioned that it was pretty dark for an Irish Red. I still think it's a little dark for an Irish Red, but something to keep in mind when you're talking about color is it's kind of relative to the density. For example, you see here it's a nice amber color, but here in this it's black. I mean, obviously you all understand color and how that works. So something to remember, if you look at your carboy and you think it's not the right color, it's not necessarily going to be that color when you pour it into a glass. There's also some other things you can do to improve the color. When we drink beer, we'll drink them out of 1 or 2 glasses. One of these glasses. Now if you have a stout, I usually drink it out of this glass. Now even if I put in this glass, it's still going to look black. But this glass, even if the stout's a little on the light side, it looks black because there's more liquid for the light to pass through. So you drink a stout out of this. Whereas if you're drinking an amber colored beer like this one, I drink it out of this glass because it's smaller, there's less light to pass through, and you're going to get a lighter color. So for presentation, This would be for stouts and dark colored beers, and this would be for something like an Irish Red and really light colored beers, because it will make your beer look lighter. So that's a little trick for presentation. Alright, so let me tell you what else I've been doing as this siphon. Alright, over here we can see what looks like water. All I did is I sanitized this pan because I was not bringing it to a boil. I added 3/4 of a cup of sugar to 2 cups of water. I got it hot until it was clear, so I knew the water was dissolved. The reason I do this is because, well, let me back up a minute. You should use corn sugar. When I said sugar, you should use corn sugar. I was out of corn sugar, so I used cane sugar. It's such a small amount of sugar, it's not going to be a big deal. So in that first step, when I was saying use 2 pounds of corn sugar, you cannot substitute that for cane sugar without affecting the taste. But here, you probably can, because it's only 3/4 of a cup. Now the reason I'm doing this is because that beer should have been completely fermented, meaning all the sugar should have been eaten by the yeast in that beer. So there should be no sugar left in that beer. So when we put in the bottle, we want our beer to be fizzy. The reason it's fizzy in a home brew, and some people will actually carbonate their beer with CO2, but I don't like the idea of that. Most home brews are fizzy, and beer used to be fizzy because you make an airtight seal. The yeast is still working. It's still creating alcohol, and the CO2 is the byproduct of yeast, and that's making your bubbles, and that's why the beer fizzes. So we need something for the yeast to eat, or we'll have flat beer, and flat beer is not good. Now this is really 3/4 of a cup is where you should start. If you do that and you think the beer should be a little more fizzy, add a little more sugar. If you think it should be a little less fizzy, add a little less. 3/4 to a cup is usually where it is. The problem is when you go with a whole cup, even though it's only 1/4 of a cup more sugar, it can make a huge difference. And you can have beer that when you open it, it just fizzes out, and the whole beer will just fizz out as head, and you won't have anything but head. Now, if you have made that mistake, just fill your pitcher or whatever, because there's going to be a lot of head come out of that beer. Fill that with the head and just let it sit for like 20 minutes, half an hour, and you will eventually get a beer out of it. Another thing is if you've noticed one has too much head, put it in the fridge and make sure it's cold. If it still has too much head, put it in the freezer, and that will at least alleviate the problem to some extent. Do keep in mind beer can freeze because your alcohol percent's usually around 4 or 5, so it can freeze solid, but the colder it is, the less head it's going to have. Now let's see where my siphoning is. Looks like we're still going. Yeah, looks like we've got a little while left to go with the siphoning. You notice my bottles are ready. Those have been sanitized. Caps. I need caps. Those are corks. I want to take out a bowl and count out how many caps I need. Generally speaking, with these 5-gallon batches, you will have 48 beers, sometimes even a little more, so I'm going to count out 48 caps. Best case scenario would be to have already sanitized your caps with sanitary solution. Because I wasn't thinking, I forgot to do that. So I'm going to dump just a touch of my sanitizer in there. This stuff's really pretty powerful, so I don't want much. Move that around and shake that around. It's unlikely that you're going to get infection from your caps anyway. It's the bottles you really have to worry about. But what have I said about brewing from the beginning? Sanitize, sanitize, sanitize.